Welcome to the Power in Motion podcast, the show for women who want to develop a kinder relationship with their body so you can feel healthy, happy, and confident without restricting food, doing torturous exercise, or constantly worrying about the number on the scale. I'm your host, Kim Hagel, size-inclusive fitness specialist and certified non-diet health and life coach specializing in body image. This podcast is here to provide weight-neutral, health at every size aligned information and coaching on sustainable habits and mindset shifts so you can feel your very best in the body you have right now. Let's lace up our runners and go for a walk while we chat. Hello, and welcome back to the Power in Motion podcast. I'm your host, Kim Hagel, and today we have a special guest on the show. But before I introduce her, I do want to give a brief content warning here that we will be discussing eating disorders, binge eating, and disordered eating on this episode. So if that's not something that's good for you to listen to right now, please feel free to skip this episode. So Dr. Marianne Miller has been in the mental health field for 27 years and has specialized in eating disorders for the last 12 years. She was a full-time academic for 12 years and had a part-time eating disorder practice for much of that time until she left the university and went into private practice full-time in 2018. Dr. Marianne loves working with eating disorders as a therapist and a coach. She takes a non-diet, feminist approach that helps people of all genders live empowered, authentic lives. She embraces the health at every size model and is neurodivergent and LGBTQ1A affirming. In our conversation, Dr. Marianne shared her personal journey with eating disorders, which led her to do this work. We discussed the misconceptions around eating disorders and how they can often be left undiagnosed and untreated because people don't show the stereotypical signs. We talked specifically about binge eating, what it is, and how it's different from just overeating, what leads to binge eating, and Dr. Marianne shared where people often go wrong in trying to stop binging themselves and how she successfully supports her clients and patients. I personally found this conversation very enlightening, and I know you'll leave with some practical tips and next steps if this is something you struggle with yourself. Dr. Marianne's links, including her podcast, Dr. Marianne Land, are all in the show notes and on my website at www.radiantvitality.ca/podcast. So let's jump into the interview with Dr. Marianne Miller. Dr. Marianne, welcome to the Power in Motion podcast. I am so excited to have you join us here today on the show and to speak with you about your work with eating disorders and binge eating disorder in particular. Thanks so much for taking the time to come and speak with us today.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. It's an honor.
Oh, thank you. Well, why don't you get us started first by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing this work of treating eating disorders?
Oh, that's a great story. So there are two components to the story. So there's the professional explanation, and then there's the personal explanation. So I'll start with the professional explanation. So I got my PhD and I injured my back, and so I was looking for an academic position in the early 2000s, and I had a private practice in Texas, which is where I got my PhD. And I was working with a lot of chronic pain clients, and I had chronic pain myself because of the injury. And so when I moved to San Diego, California in 2006, I began a part-time private practice as I was a full-time academic. And so the part-time private practice really focused on people with chronic pain. And so I did that for several years. I ran a chronic pain support group for 3 years. And what I was finding is that a lot of my clients with chronic pain had disordered eating symptoms. And so, yeah, it was really interesting. And so one summer, my university offered a class on eating disorders. And so I sat in on the class, read all the textbooks. I fell in love with it. It's like, oh, this is something I really want to do. Just really felt called to do that. And so I'm lucky that I live in San Diego, that there's a lot of places to get training. Like the University of California at San Diego has a world-renowned eating disorder center, both treatment and research, and they have weekly trainings that they offer to providers in the community. And I went to those for like 3 years, and then I got someone to supervise me for a year in eating disorders, and really developed a lot of skills and training and experience, because in grad school they don't teach eating disorder training. It's just not part of the curriculum. It's like maybe half a day or half a class
Really?
that they talk, if they talk about eating disorder. So you really have to make a big effort getting extra training.
Interesting.
And so I did, and now uh, I started doing the part-time private practice, really focused on eating disorders. And then began growing, and I loved it so much that I ended up leaving academia in 2018 and doing that full time, that's what I've been doing for the past 6 years. So I guess it is 6 years. It's gone by so quickly.
Well,
So I've been working with eating disorders for about 12 years.
well, that's great, and I'm so glad that you're doing this work because there are so few that are really well qualified in treating eating disorders,
Yep.
and I was unaware of how it's not really taught
No,
in your postgraduate education. So,
no, no, unless you do your dissertation research on it, or you're,
gotcha.
working with a professor who specializes in research on eating disorders, and you get some kind of practicum placement, but that wasn't available in my university. So yeah, so I had
Mhm.
to seek outside training, which is that's what the majority have to do.
I see. Okay, so you said that's the professional side of the story. You said there was a
Yeah.
personal side of the story too. Would you
Yeah.
be interested in sharing that?
Oh,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. So the personal side is that I had an eating disorder myself, is that beginning at the very least 8 years old, if not younger, I started dieting, and, doing the food restriction, and did that quite a bit. And it really ramped up in middle school.
Mm,
And looking back, I definitely met the criteria for anorexia. Maybe not the I had a drop of weight, but maybe not the quote seriously underweight version. A lot of people are calling that atypical anorexia, although most people don't necessarily have that weight drop,
mhm,
or I
mhm,
had a
mhm.
weight drop at, like, in terms of like
Not enough by
a
their
certain,
standards.
yeah, exactly, enough, and we're putting air quotes around that.
Mhm.
And so, and then when I was in high school, it's like my body was like, we're tired of restricting. We need to keep growing. So I switched to binge eating. So I would have like months of binge eating, and then I'd go back to restricting. And that cycled in high school and then in college. And then what happened is that I was working after college, I got laid off, and I decided to go to Russia for a year.
Mm.
I lived in Siberia. That's one fun fact about me. I got a one-way ticket to Siberia. And so I lived there for a year. But prior to going, I was so like anxious and feeling very overwhelmed that I started over exercising, and
Mm,
that became part of my eating disorder. And that actually continued while I was in Russia and through graduate school until it was like a month after I got my PhD. I was snowboarding and injured my back, and it was because of over exercise. It was just, I like ran a race the night before. It was like New Year's Eve. And then
mm,
on New Year's Day, I went snowboarding. It was just insane because I was trying to compensate for what I was eating. And so I injured my back. And so it switched more to the full on binge eating disorder because I couldn't really exercise.
right.
And then eventually I tried different therapists. couldn't find an eating disorder specialist who was really trained. And then finally, when I moved to San Diego, I found one and worked with her, and she totally knew what she was doing, and joined a sport group, and I was able to recover. And so I know what it's like to be in the thick of an eating disorder and struggling not to binge. And like, I can't even remember the last time I binged. I mean, it's been years and years. And just the feeling of freedom, not only from binging, but freedom from obsessing about food,
Mhm.
eating and body image, 80, 90, 95% of the time. So
Mhm.
where I'm thinking about it like less than 10% or even sometimes less than 5% of the time. And so I know what that's like, and I know that it's possible. And I've helped people go down in these, in that percentages of being obsessing about food, eating, and body image. And so that's, it's kind of a big mission of mine, is to help people.
Well, it's very powerful to be able to, one, recover, and then two, use your healing journey to help others. I've been very open
Yes.
on the show here about my own recovery journey, and that's why I do the work that I do myself.
Yeah.
And though I was never formally diagnosed with an eating disorder, which I'd like to
Mhm.
talk about, one thing I have shared is how my disordered eating habits and like over exercising and under eating and an obsession with the cleanliness of my food
Mm.
was praised by so many
Yep.
people.
Yep.
Right? So can you talk about how society's obsession with wellness and thinness like actually fuels disordered habits and prevents people from getting diagnosed and treated?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's worsened with the growth of social media. I think there's a lot of things about social media that are fabulous. And I mean, I have a very active Instagram account. And so, to be able to provide, accurate education on eating disorders and eating disorder recovery. And and just my own story about re- being recovered, and I think that having that as a resource is very helpful. I think Gen Z have learned so much about mental health from
Mhm.
TikToks,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
they're just so much more savvy about the terminology. And they're like, yeah, we can talk about mental health. That's no big deal, kind of
Mhm.
thing. And I think alongside that, the growth of wellness industry and cleanness, and this is what I eat in a day. And
Mhm. Mhm.
just, oh,
Mhm.
those posts and reels drive me bananas.
Right.
And it's almost like it's become a morality issue of just like, I'm a more moral person if I eat, quote, clean, and if I eat healthy. And people who don't eat that way, they're like not as morally superior as I
Mhm.
am.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they eat that stuff. And
Mhm.
it's like, oh, and the wellness culture was really present in my family growing up. I mean, I grew up in Colorado, which itself is very kind of health and wellness focused as a state, compared to some other states I lived in over the years. Southern California, I mean, come on. We're like,
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
it's
I've watched Selling
insane.
Sunset and
That oh,
Vanderpump Rules and
it's
all of those things.
insane. It's like green juice is bleeding through people's veins. And I think that it's a very unfortunate thing, in that it's also very profitable. So the
For sure.
you know, $1 billion, and that's just in the US health and wellness industry. That's that's just putting a lot of pressure and really conveying the message that you're eating wrong. You're eating unclean, like this is bad for your body. Not based on research, and it's based on people's opinions or the marketing of what they're trying to sell you. So, or follow this influencer and buy these products or buy these programs and things like that.
Mhm.
And so we have to really break that down, and and get to where what I do for my clients and what I have learned for myself is that an all foods fit model.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And that's easier said than done when you're in it, right? Like,
Right. Yeah,
you
it's
know,
hard.
for sure it is. But yeah, when I look back and I see how extreme and rigid and obsessive everything was, and I when you were saying like, look at what that person's eating and that, like there was time where I felt better than
Oh,
everybody.
oh
Like
yeah.
I was
So did
so
I.
much better than everybody who was
Oh
filling their
yeah.
body full of all this poison and stuff.
Yeah.
But what people didn't see and what I even like was embarrassed to acknowledge myself was like how miserable I was, like how much of my life was consumed with this like measuring everything I was eating and like sourcing out all the perfect
Yes.
foods and like ignoring my hunger and like burning off the calories and like it's crazy,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, the all foods fit approach has allowed for a whole lot more calm and peace and just enjoyment of life in general.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, I think that like part of the reason why maybe I wasn't diagnosed is one, I was in denial about what I was actually experiencing
Mhm.
because I thought I was just being healthy
Mhm.
and that was validated everywhere that I turned. But I also think there's a lot of misinformation about
Mhm.
eating disorders. And you touched on one at the beginning in your own journey of having the symptoms of anorexia, but it not being diagnosed because you didn't
Mhm.
fall into that severely underweight category. And I think there's a lot who still believe that anorexia means you're 80 pounds or less or
Mhm.
something like that. So can you kind of touch on some of the misinformation or common misbeliefs about eating disorders?
Yes, that eating disorders have a look,
Mhm.
and that's the people who are seriously underweight. And I don't even like the word underweight because that assumes that there is a perfect weight, but
Mhm. Mhm.
seriously, at lower weights than what is socially acceptable. And that they're having health complications because of the lower weight. Like
Mhm.
they're very low heart rates, like their hair is falling out, their, skin is very thin, and a lot of other things. Sometimes they get fine hair on their body that's trying to provide them warmth, the stopping of the periods for girls and women. So all that thing happened, all those, that's what a lot of people look for. That's what the medical field looks for. Although a lot of times they have very little training
Mhm.
themselves, if
Mhm.
any, on eating disorders, unless it's kind of like mental health providers, healthcare providers have to either work in an eating disorder treatment center or they have to work or get specialized training in order to have this specialty. And it's just not readily available. And so, I've had clients who needed to be in the hospital and see physicians who are like, oh, they're just fine. They're athletes. That's why their heart rate is so low, and they're just like,
Mhm.
"No, they need to be in the hospital because they could die. Like, they could have cardiac failure." And
Wow.
so, yeah, so it's actually, there's just so many health risks and that people just don't look at, and I think for me, thinking back to my middle school years, I mean, it was in the '80s, and we knew even less than we do now. It was, like, barely anything.
Mhm.
And that people I just got praised for my weight loss. I was just eating very little is what I saw people in my family do, and so I just assumed that that was okay, and that's what you had to do to have very low weight. Like all the diets I had been on,
Mm.
the popular diets, like it's funny, my husband likes '80s television shows, and so he was
Yes.
watching one, and they were just talking so much about weight loss and crazy diets and stuff. And I mean, you hear it now, but back then there was just the level of ignorance that
Yes.
and I know unawareness of how damaging that can be. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
talking about yes, you definitely did, talking about the misconceptions about eating disorders.
Yes.
And I think quite simply that there's the belief that they have a look, or that,
Right.
that we have to be deathly ill
Yes.
before we're diagnosed. And yeah,
Right.
and that
Exactly.
they can exist like
Mhm.
invisibly, right?
Yes.
Invisibly.
Yeah. And all types of bodies. I
Mm.
think someone told me, I was interviewing someone for my podcast yesterday, and they told me that really only 6% of eating disorders has that like classic eating disorder look. Like that's a really low percentage.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it doesn't surprise me, like based on my clientele over the last 12 years, like for most of them on the outside, you probably wouldn't be able to guess that they had an eating disorder.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I
So,
hit it very well.
oh
And
yeah.
even I mean, I even did visit the doctor's office with some health problems. I missed my period for 9 months. I wasn't pregnant,
Yep. Yep.
and my heart rate was low, but I was athletic and I was working out all of the
Yep.
time. Wasn't
I know.
diagnosed,
I
and
know.
I
It's
look
really
back and
sad.
yeah, it's pretty scary. And you talked about your dieting history starting in middle school, and I think that's not uncommon for a lot
No,
of
I
girls and
actually started in elementary school.
yeah. Yeah,
Hmm.
and peaked kind of, or like
Peaked,
rose
right. Exactly.
at
Peaked
that
in middle
age.
school. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a statistic around like dieting and developing eating disorders. Do you know what that is off the top of your head?
Oh, I don't know the exact statistics, but I do know that researchers have found that tweens and teens who diet, they're statistically significantly more likely to develop an eating disorder. So, yeah,
Mm.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
really sad. Hmm.
it is sad. And I mean, logically, it makes sense that we would end up there, right? After multiple failed attempts at dieting,
Hmm.
just
Yeah,
become more and more restrictive, right? To try to get
right.
that weight off and keep it off.
And blaming yourself when the diets don't work or they don't stick, that
Hmm.
kind of thing, because they're impossible to attain or maintain over a long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk specifically about binge eating, because I know that most of your
Mhm,
programming centers around binge
mhm,
eating.
mhm.
Can you
Yeah.
can you first define exactly what binge eating is and how it maybe is different from what we often label as binge eating, where we're eating past fullness or just simply eating a lot because we're really hungry? Like, how do you classify binge eating?
A binge eating episode is eating a large amount of food, a relatively large amount of food for the person over a short amount of time. And it's is something that occurs outside of quote eating events, like in the US, like Thanksgiving, Super Bowl Sunday, like those are big eating events.
Right.
So, holiday seasons, even maybe birthdays, that kind of thing. So if it's outside of these events and it happens at least once a week
Okay.
for 3 months, and this is what happens after the binge, is this huge feelings of shame and guilt and and just self-criticism. Yeah.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm. And why? Maybe this isn't a simple question to answer, but what usually triggers a binge eating episode, or why might a person binge?
So the number one cause of a a binge eating episode is restriction.
Mm,
And that's a lot of times what people don't know. And my clients come and I say, okay, tell me what you eat regularly in a day. And 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 if they're binging at night, it's very common that they're not eating very much during the day. They might skip breakfast and then might have a small light lunch. And then by the time they hit dinner, or even, if they're a teen, when they come home from school, they've built up this huge glucose deficit. And
mhm.
so trying to stop that is like standing in front of a bullet train, holding your hand up, going, stop. And you just can't. because our bodies are really intelligent. They want to survive. And so they'll just plow through any sort of quote willpower, and eating disorders aren't about willpower, and get you the food. And it's usually very high calorie, you know, high
Mm-hmm.
calorically dense food that's high fat, carbs, protein, that kind of thing, because your body wants to get the most bang for its buck.
Sure.
And so people are like, why I can't, I'm so out of control with these kind of foods. And it's like, well, I totally validate that feeling and I know how that feels like. And it's more of an indication of your body not being fully nourished. Like people can have binge eating disorder and be undernourished. People in larger bodies,
Mm-hmm.
undernourished.
Mm-hmm.
No, and that's hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. And
Yeah.
so nourishment and consistent nourishment or throughout the day, or what I call mechanical eating, or schedule eating, is a huge part of recovery. So that's restriction is like the number one reason why people binge.
Yeah.
Other reasons are emotion regulation
Mm-hmm.
issues, emotional discomfort, feeling overwhelmed, tapped out, like you've given just everything to
Mm-hmm.
everyone else. And can I just give to myself already, while
Mm-hmm.
everyone and all the kids are in bed? They're just things that make people more susceptible to binge eating, like family conflicts, I think is a big one, or, friendship, relationship conflict. I think that the inability to articulate one's needs, or just a complete lack of understanding of what your needs are. So
Mm-hmm.
you can ask for your needs to be met, or maybe you're in a family where your needs aren't getting met. And so you have to get those needs met outside of your family. So a lot of those things are just so interactive and, eh,
And
I
intertwined, I'm sure. Right?
intertwined.
Yeah.
That was the word I was thinking of, but they
Yeah.
do interact in that one kind of feeds, haha, off each other.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking back like to my own personal experience, and I can think of many examples where I would go to a social event
Mhm.
and bring my nice veggie tray and all the clean foods that I was
Oh,
allowed to
been
eat,
there.
right? And then
Mhm.
watching all of these other people eating the delicious like appetizers and lovely things, and I would have so much willpower and not touch any of it, but I would be jealous. So and overwhelmed and hungry and all
Mhm.
the things. And then I'd come home from the party and put my kids to bed and then come back downstairs and grab a bag of chips and devour the whole thing.
Right. Yep.
Right? Because of the
Mhm.
feeling of restriction and all of the emotions of like living this lie.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then I would feel just completely ashamed. And what I would usually follow that up with the next day is like a
Restriction.
2-hour run and
Mhm.
restriction, right?
Mhm. Which would lead to another binge. So, yeah. So
Eventually, it would. Yeah.
that's the binge eating cycle.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
So, like, can you talk to the mistakes that a lot of us make when we try to fix our binge eating ourselves? I mean, I think we touched on them in that example, but just to clarify.
Yeah, well, I think finding the right support is really important. If for some reason going to an eating disorder therapist who specializes in binge eating isn't accessible, there are other supports. I have an online membership program that's kind of self-paced you can go through. I also can pair that with coaching if people want to add that as well. You have to just be very careful though when you're looking for those kinds of programs, because some of them are diet programs in disguise.
Mm-hmm,
Some of them are, yeah, we're gonna get you out of binging, get you finished with binging, but they're still restrictive.
How might somebody know when they're looking at things like what are the red flags to look for? How would they know it's a diet in disguise?
That is a great question. I think that asking how much experience the person running the program has had, working with eating disorders specifically
Mhm,
instead
mhm.
of like binging or just nutrition. To say like how much experience have you had working with this? What is their, training, knowledge, experience, education kind of thing with this? If they give you kind of a vague answer, that would be a red flag. I think that when people say, "Well, I've been working in the nutrition field for these many years," and it's okay. So, how many of those years have you spent working with people with diagnosed eating disorders?
Mhm.
I think that that's an important thing. Well, I work with people with disordered eating. Okay, but what about people with like diagnosed
Yeah,
eating disorders
yeah.
and who struggle with that? And then asking the question about, i- if you it how do you work with people who wanna lose weight? And someone who knows their stuff and has an eating disorder history, they will say, what I say is that this is not a weight loss program, is that we're just working on reducing and eliminating the binge eating. We're
Yeah.
just focusing on that because all of the research out there on the evidence-based modalities of helping people reduce and eliminate their binging has nothing to do with weight. And so if they're doing work that's based on research, weight can't even be part of the conversation. And that's the big pill to swallow for some people because some people say, well, I want to stop binging and I want to lose weight. It's like, okay, uh, we're not even talking about losing weight because
Yeah.
we're just talking about reducing
And
and
so to
eliminating.
just clarify for us why it is harmful to focus on weight loss when you're trying to stop binging.
Because that means you're adding restriction,
Exactly. Yeah,
and restriction leads to more binging.
right.
And you got to stop restricting in order to stop binging. That's the
Mhm,
bottom line.
mhm. Yeah, so there's no way to control weight when you're trying to stop that behavior.
Yeah, and I mean, and really, not only uh, not focus on your weight, but really focus on getting to the place at which you can trust your body again.
Mhm, mhm.
Because restriction means you're looking for external rules uh, for what your body should look like when there's so much like genetic, biological things that contribute to what our body's going to be.
100%.
That's, those external rules are very reductionistic and
Yeah.
just really boil down to like one simple answer for the masses, which
Mhm.
is just completely ridiculous.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
completely ridiculous,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think of, like, my family history, like, I don't come from, like, a bunch of aristocratic people. I come from, like, the serving class of in in the UK, and they were the hard workers. The people were built for hard work, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm not going to be a person who is gonna be, someone who looks like a ballet dancer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's just not in my genetic makeup.
No. No, and I think we need to spend more time, like, educating ourselves about that we're not all meant to look the same, right? Like, bodies
Right,
come in all shapes and sizes, and that's normal. That's how it should be.
right, and so much of it is based on racism is,
Mhm.
I think every podcast now I bring up Dr. Sabrina String's
Mhm, mhm.
novel, or not novel, but very informative book, Fearing the Black Body,
Yeah.
and about how, the aristocrats as early as the 1600s,
Yep.
y- you know, old, larger bodied white men said, we want our women, our aristocratic white women to look different than black women because they were the slaves
Mhm,
at the time. And so we're going to say that this is what the white women should look like, very slender, not eating very much. And
mhm.
so even, when I said jokingly, I don't have an aristocratic background, like that's not even biologically based. I mean, that was very,
Controlled and
yeah,
manipulated.
stereotyped and manipulated, very
Yeah.
great words for that.
Mhm,
So,
mhm, mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. It's this idea of moral superiority based on thinness goes way, way back.
way
And
back.
I'm glad you touched on like the white supremacy piece of that. Like
Hmm.
it's really awful.
Hmm.
Okay, so I know we're getting near the end here, but there's one other question I really want to touch on, which is you mentioned at the beginning how shame and self-loathing and guilt are such a big part of binge eating and I'm sure all the other eating disorders as well.
Hmm.
So, how do you help your clients cultivate a sense of self-compassion and self-love? Is that part of your treatment modality?
Yeah, yeah. I think I use a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and family systems therapy.
Mm,
And for the cognitive behavioral and dialectical behavior therapy, there are components of compassion based. There's compassion based CBT, and then dialectical behavior therapy or DBT is based in mindfulness, which is moment to moment non judgmental acceptance. There's a
mm,
whole lot of self compassion built in that. And
yeah.
so, really, sometimes teaching the skills t- and teaching people how to kind of fake it till you make it, like act as if you're
Mhm,
compassionate toward yourself, even if
mhm.
they're not feeling it. And eventually they will the feelings will follow if they instate the behaviors 1st.
That's a good point to make that we can just
Hmm.
practice meeting ourselves with compassion, even if we're not
Yeah.
100% convinced that we're worthy of
Yeah.
it, right?
Fake it.
Yeah. Or maybe it's like, how would you speak to your best friend or your child
Yes.
if they did
Yes.
this, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes I have clients like think of that inner child part of them. I mean, I don't do a ton of inner child work, but think of like, when was the first time you started feeling badly about your body? Like for me, it would be 8 years old, and if not younger. And so for me, it would be okay. I want you to think about that 8-year-old Marianne, and what does she need right now? She needs a lot of love, a lot of acceptance, a lot of message that you're okay and you are a beautiful person, you have a beautiful soul, and really leaning into that healing by healing the relationship with that like broken, wounded part of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so powerful, right? Because
Hmm.
our body remembers,
Hmm.
how we felt at that young age, even if we don't specifically, right? But going back and
Hmm. Yep.
reparenting or just like speaking to that younger version of yourself that learned to believe something about themselves that maybe wasn't true,
Right.
giving that piece some nurturing and some compassion. I've done that kind of work myself, and it's been very powerful.
And yes. It's interesting. I never had a therapist do that work with me, but I've done it with myself. And it's been really, really powerful. And I still do it for every now and then over the
Yeah.
years if I feel like I need some of that. I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah.
come to me, little 8-year-old Marianne.
Yeah.
I'll give you
Yeah.
a big hug."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I love that. Is there anything else that is pressing on your heart that you would like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I really like to convey that if you struggle with binge eating, it's not your fault.
Mm,
There's a lot of evidence that all eating disorders, including binge eating disorder, are biologically based. That if you have binge eating disorder, that there are areas of your brain that are not working as efficiently and as effectively compared to people without binge eating disorder. And so recovery is possible because of neuroplasticity, which means that we can change the neural pathways in our brain.
mm,
And so the fastest way to do that is to get help from someone who knows what they're doing and has, a lot of training and experience to help you change those pathways and literally create a new brain for yourself. Like I have a completely new brain from when
yeah.
I did and when I was in the thick of my eating disorder.
Yeah, and I'm proud to say I do too, and I think that's such
Yeah.
a good point to bring forward is that you can change your brain. And then it's not your fault that your brain is thinking the way that it is,
Nope,
right?
not your fault.
You can recover, and you just need someone to
Yes.
help you along the way. So
Yes.
on that note, can you just give our listeners a rundown on where they can follow you, what
Yeah.
programs and services you offer
Yeah.
so that they can stay in touch?
Yes. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So Instagram at Dr. Marianne Miller. So my first name is spelled in the French way. It's Marianne, one word. My website is drmariannemiller.com, and you'll find all the information about, if you live in the states of California or Texas, I can provide eating disorder therapy. If you live elsewhere, you can join some of my coaching programs. Really, if you live anywhere, I have the Dr. Marianne Land Binge Eating Recovery membership program that's $99 a month.
Wow.
And then coaching programs is more one-to-one designed. And then I have a podcast, which is Dr. Marianne Land, an eating disorder recovery podcast, which you, Kim, will be guesting on later this year. I'm very
Right.
excited.
Me too.
And so, so you can find me in all those places.
Thanks for sharing that, and I'm glad to hear that you have different levels of service no matter where
Right.
somebody might be on their journey, right? So whether it's
Yes,
the free
exactly.
podcast or the membership or more one-on-one service, sounds like Dr. Marianne has something available for you. So if you're
Yeah.
struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out, and at the very least, tune into the podcast because I've been listening and there's a wealth of great information on there.
Oh, thanks for saying that. That means a lot to me.
Well, I wouldn't say it if it wasn't true. I
I believe
really,
you.
really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show today, Dr. Marianne, and sharing so much of your wisdom about eating disorders with our listeners.
It's an honor.
Thanks for tuning into the Power in Motion podcast today. If you love what you're learning here, then I invite you to take the next step of embodying these concepts into your own life so that you can live your healthiest, happiest life and never again feel held back by your body. Coaching is the fastest, most efficient pathway to taking what you know in your head to actually applying it and seeing results. Whether you're looking to make changes around movement, food, body image, or all three, I'm here to help you nurture a kind, respectful, and trusting relationship with your body so you can feel your very best. Click the link in the show notes to book a free consultation, and together we'll uncover what's getting in the way of you having the results you want. You'll leave this call knowing exactly what you need to work on, and together we'll explore whether one of my coaching offers is a good fit for you. I can't wait to meet you.